Why did the school counselor lock her office door during our routine check-in? Ms. Kendra Blakely reached behind me and turned the deadbolt on her office door with a quiet click that made my stomach drop. Then she pulled out her phone and started taking photos of my arms before I could process what was happening. She'd been my guidance counselor at Northwood High for 3 years, handling my college application prep and schedule adjustments, and we'd had probably 20 meetings in this same office without anything remotely like this occurring. Her voice stayed calm and professional as she asked me to roll up my sleeves completely and turn my arms over slowly, documenting something I couldn't see, but she clearly could. When I asked what she was doing, she said we needed to have a serious conversation about my home situation, and she needed visual documentation before we started, because she was legally required to file a report with Child Protective Services within the next 2 hours. I sat there in the chair across from her desk, watching her photograph my forearms and upper arms from multiple angles, completely confused about what was happening because I'd come in to discuss my early decision application to Cornell, and now apparently CPS was getting involved in my life. I'd been living with my mother and stepfather, Russell Vaughn, for 6 years since Mom married him when I was 11. My biological father had died in a construction accident when I was 9, leaving Mom devastated and struggling financially. Russell had seemed like a gift at first, stable and successful, a regional sales manager for a pharmaceutical distribution company who traveled frequently but made good money. He'd moved into our modest house in the suburbs, paid off Mom's debts, and gradually taken over managing household finances and decisions. Mom had been grateful, relieved to have someone capable handling the adult responsibilities that had overwhelmed her as a widowed single parent. Russell was strict about rules and schedules, but he'd explained this was necessary structure that I'd lacked after my father's death. He monitored my schoolwork closely, required detailed accounts of how I spent my time, and established systems for everything from homework completion to household chores. At first, the structure had actually helped. My grades improved from B's and C's to straight A's under Russell's supervision. He'd created spreadsheets tracking my assignments, test scores, and GPA with formulas calculating exactly what grades I needed to maintain my academic standing. He'd established a study schedule that blocked out specific hours for each subject, with timers ensuring I spent adequate time on each task. He'd eliminated distractions like video games and social media, saying these were privileges I could earn back once I proved I could maintain excellence without them. Mom praised him for caring so much about my education, for being the father figure I needed, for investing time and energy into my success. Teachers commented on my improved performance and consistent work. I'd internalized the message that Russell's control was helping me, that his strict oversight was evidence of dedication, rather than something darker. But the rules had gradually expanded beyond academics, into every aspect of my life. Russell required detailed schedules for any time spent outside the house, with exact locations, contact information for whoever I'd be with, and regular check-ins via text. He'd installed tracking software on my phone that monitored my location constantly, saying this was normal parental oversight for safety. He controlled what I ate, creating meal plans based on what he called optimization for athletic and academic performance, though I wasn't involved in any sports. He'd eliminated foods he deemed inflammatory or problematic, leaving me eating primarily lean proteins, vegetables, and specific grains he'd researched. He weighed me weekly, tracking the numbers in another spreadsheet, adjusting my meal portions if the scale showed variations he didn't approve of. He scheduled my sleep with enforced bedtimes and wake times, coming into my room to ensure compliance. The physical discipline had started subtly and escalated so gradually that I hadn't recognized it as abuse until Ms. Blakely started taking photos. Russell used what he called correction techniques when I violated rules or failed to meet standards. Initially, these were things like extra chores or loss of privileges, but over time they'd evolved into physical punishments he framed as training exercises. If I missed a homework deadline, I'd have to hold a plank position for increasingly long periods while he timed me. If I failed to check in during outings, I'd do wall sits until my legs shook and collapsed. If my weight fluctuated beyond his acceptable range, I'd do burpees or jumping jacks in sets of 50 or 100. He called this accountability, saying that physical consequences created stronger neural pathways about responsibility than mere verbal warnings. Mom had accepted this explanation, relieved that Russell was handling my discipline since she'd always struggled with follow-through on consequences. The punishments had intensified during my junior year when academic pressure increased and I'd started making small mistakes more frequently. Russell's correction techniques expanded to include him gripping my arms hard enough to leave marks when he wanted to ensure I was paying attention during lectures about my failures. He'd hold my wrists or biceps while explaining exactly what I'd done wrong and what needed to change, his fingers digging in with pressure that hurt, but he'd say was necessary to cut through my obvious inability to listen properly. He'd squeeze until I acknowledged his points, until I repeated back his instructions, until he was satisfied I understood. The bruises appeared in patterns I'd learned to hide with long sleeves, even in warm weather. When Mom asked about the clothing choices, I'd say I was cold, or the sleeves looked better, or I had a rash I was self-conscious about. She'd accepted these explanations without question, because Russell had trained both of us not to question his methods. My social isolation had happened so incrementally that I hadn't noticed until I had essentially no friends left by senior year. Russell had systematically eliminated my friendships by making social activities so difficult to arrange that I'd stopped trying. Every hangout required extensive advance notice, detailed information, and his explicit approval, which he'd often deny, citing academic priorities or schedule conflicts. When he did approve social time, he'd require check-ins every 30 minutes, making conversations awkward and anxious as I'd interrupt to text him updates. Friends had gradually stopped inviting me because I was never available and weird about my phone when I did show up. By senior year, I ate lunch alone, didn't attend school events, and spent weekends studying or doing household tasks Russell assigned. He'd framed this isolation as me naturally outgrowing immature peers who didn't share my academic focus, and I'd accepted that explanation because questioning Russell's logic had consequences. The college application process had become another arena for Russell's control. He'd decided I'd apply early decision to Cornell, his alma mater, because he said the family legacy connection improved my chances significantly. He'd written my personal essay himself, saying my draft lacked the sophistication admissions committees expected. He'd selected my extracurricular activities based on what would look best on applications, rather than what I enjoyed. He'd coached my SAT prep so intensively that I'd scored 1,540, but the achievement felt hollow because it came from his methods rather than my effort. He monitored every aspect of the application process, requiring me to show him each component before submission. The guidance counselor recommendation was the one piece he couldn't directly control, which was why I had monthly meetings with Ms. Blakely to ensure she'd write something appropriately strong. This particular meeting was supposed to be final application review before the November deadline. I'd arrived at Ms. Blakely's office directly after fourth period, same as always, expecting to discuss my essay and activity list. But she'd looked at me differently today, her professional expression cracking into something concerned. She'd asked how I was doing, using a tone that suggested she meant something beyond academics. I'd said fine, everything was on track for the application. She'd asked about home life, about stress levels, about how I was managing senior year pressure. I'd given the same answers I always gave. Everything was fine, Russell kept me organized, I had good systems in place. Then she'd asked me to show her my arms, and when I'd hesitated, she'd said she needed to see them immediately. I'd rolled up my sleeves automatically, conditioned to comply with adult authority, and her face had gone very still. That's when she'd stood up, walked past me to lock the door, and started taking photographs. The bruises on my forearms were relatively fresh, 4 days old from Russell's lecture about incomplete calculus homework, oval-shaped marks from his fingertips in shades of purple and yellow-green. My upper arms had older bruising in various stages of healing, creating a pattern Ms. Blakely apparently recognized as intentional rather than accidental. She asked who'd caused these injuries, and I'd said they weren't injuries exactly, that Russell used physical correction as part of discipline, that it was structured accountability training. Ms. Blakely, who'd been a school counselor for 19 years and held a master's degree in clinical psychology, said what I'd just described was physical abuse regardless of what Russell called it, and she was legally mandated to report suspected child abuse within specific timeframes. The photographs were documentation she'd need when making the report. I told her she was misunderstanding, that this wasn't abuse, that Russell's methods were strict but effective, that my grades proved the system worked. She asked if I was afraid of Russell, and I said no, which was technically true, because I wasn't afraid exactly, more anxious about disappointing him or failing to meet his standards. She asked if I'd ever tried to tell my mother about the bruising, and I explained that Mom knew Russell used physical corrections, that she'd approved his disciplinary methods. Ms. Blakely's expression shifted to something harder, and she said that a parent approving abuse didn't make it legal or acceptable, that physical punishment leaving visible injuries met the legal definition of child abuse in our state, that my mother's complicity made her culpable too. She asked about the meal control, the tracking software, the social isolation I'd mentioned in previous conversations, and as I explained Russell's various systems, she documented everything in notes that would apparently become part of an official report. She asked if Russell had ever hit me with a closed fist or used objects to strike me, and I said no, that he only used holds and grips, that the correction exercises were things I did to myself, like planks and wall sits. She said forced exercise to the point of physical collapse was also abuse, that the entire pattern I'd described constituted systematic physical and emotional abuse, even if it was framed as discipline and training. I felt my chest tighten as she reframed my entire home life, taking experiences I'd normalized and calling them by names that sounded criminal. She asked if I felt safe going home that afternoon, and the question paralyzed me because I'd never thought about safety in relation to Russell, only about compliance and performance and meeting standards. My hesitation apparently answered her question because she said she'd be contacting CPS immediately, and they'd likely want to interview me today, and I shouldn't return home until they'd assessed the situation and determined appropriate next steps. Ms. Blakely made the call to Child Protective Services while I sat in her locked office processing the idea that my life was apparently abusive. I'd thought I was a high-achieving student with a strict stepfather who cared about excellence. But listening to Ms. Blakely describe the bruising patterns, the food control, the isolation, the tracking, the forced exercises, I heard it through her professional assessment and recognized something I'd been deliberately not seeing. The CPS intake worker said they'd send a caseworker to the school within 2 hours to conduct a preliminary interview and safety assessment. Miss Blakely then called my mother, professionally informing her that she'd filed a child abuse report with CPS regarding injuries observed on my arms and that Mom should expect contact from the agency. I heard Mom's voice through the phone, shocked and defensive, saying there must be a mistake, that Russell was strict but not abusive. Ms. Blakely calmly reiterated that visible bruising from physical discipline met legal definitions of abuse and ended the call before Mom could argue further. The CPS caseworker who arrived at school was Amanda Whitfield, a woman in her 40s who'd investigated child welfare cases for 12 years and had an air of professional skepticism. She interviewed me in Ms. Blakely's office with the counselor present as a support person. Amanda asked detailed questions about Russell's discipline methods, the frequency of the physical corrections, how long the bruising typically lasted, whether I'd ever required medical attention for injuries. She photographed my arms herself with a professional camera, documenting from multiple angles with better lighting than Ms. Blakely's phone photos. She asked about emotional abuse, isolation, control, degradation, threats. As I described Russell's systems and rules and constant monitoring, Amanda documented everything methodically. She asked if I'd ever considered running away or harming myself, and I said no, that I'd focused on meeting standards so the corrections wouldn't be necessary. She explained that this response was common in abuse victims who'd internalized that their behavior caused the abuse, rather than recognizing the abuser's actions as the problem. Amanda conducted a safety assessment, asking whether I'd be in immediate danger if I returned home that afternoon. I said Russell wouldn't hurt me if I followed the rules, and Amanda pointed out that this meant I would be hurt if I didn't follow rules, which constituted danger. She said CPS could arrange emergency foster placement if I didn't feel safe, or she could conduct a home visit to confront my mother and Russell about the abuse and determine if safety planning would allow me to remain home temporarily. I didn't want foster placement because that felt extreme, so I said I'd be okay going home if Russell knew CPS was involved and watching. Amanda said she'd do a home visit that evening to establish expectations and safety protocols, and she'd be monitoring closely with follow-up visits and regular check-ins. She gave me her direct number and said to call immediately if I felt unsafe, or if Russell retaliated for the CPS report in any way. Going home that afternoon felt surreal. I walked into the house at my normal time, finding Mom in the kitchen looking like she'd been crying, her face blotchy and angry. She asked what I'd told the school counselor that prompted this nightmare CPS investigation, and I explained that Ms. Blakely had noticed the bruises and asked questions, that I'd answered honestly, that the counselor had legal obligations to report. Mom said I'd misrepresented Russell's discipline, that he'd been helping me succeed, and I'd repaid him by getting authorities involved. She said the CPS investigation could destroy Russell's career, that pharmaceutical companies didn't employ people with abuse accusations, that I'd ruined everything because I was too weak to handle the structure I needed. Her response wasn't concern about my bruising or whether I was okay, but anger that I'd exposed the family to outside scrutiny. I realized in that moment that Mom had chosen Russell's version of reality over any concern for my well-being, that she'd become complicit in the abuse by consistently supporting his methods over my needs. Russell arrived home at 6:30, his normal time, walking into a house where his control had been challenged for the first time in 6 years. Mom had clearly called him about the CPS report because he came into the kitchen where I was doing homework with an expression of barely controlled fury. He asked what I'd said to the school counselor that had brought CPS to our door, and I explained the bruising had been visible when I rolled up my sleeves, that Ms. Blakely had asked direct questions, that I'd answered honestly. Russell's face went red, and he said I'd betrayed family privacy, that I'd taken internal discipline and twisted it into abuse accusations, that I'd shown profound disrespect for everything he'd done for me. He moved toward me, and I flinched automatically, which made him freeze and recalibrate. He said he wouldn't touch me, since apparently that was abuse now, his voice dripping with sarcasm, and stormed out of the kitchen. The restraint felt threatening rather than reassuring, like he was controlling rage that would eventually explode. The CPS home visit happened at 7:30 that evening. Amanda Whitfield arrived with a supervisor, Jeffrey Landry, who'd worked in child welfare administration for 18 years. They interviewed Russell and Mom together first, asking about discipline methods and how the bruising had occurred. Russell explained his accountability system, the correction exercises, the physical holds he used to ensure I was paying attention during instruction. He framed everything as structured discipline designed to help me succeed academically, pointing to my grades and test scores as evidence the methods worked. Amanda asked if he understood that leaving bruises on a child constituted physical abuse under state law, regardless of intent or framing, and Russell said he'd been unaware the interventions left visible marks, that he'd thought the grip pressure was appropriate and temporary. This was a lie because he'd seen the bruising many times and never modified his approach, but he performed concern convincingly. Mom supported Russell completely, saying she'd approved the discipline methods, that I'd been struggling with focus and motivation after my father's death, that Russell's structure had transformed my academic performance. She said I was probably embarrassed about needing so much supervision and had exaggerated normal discipline to authority figures. Amanda asked to see my bedroom and the kitchen, documenting the tracking software on my phone, the meal planning spreadsheets on Russell's laptop, the lock on the outside of my bedroom door that Russell said was for privacy, but could also prevent me from leaving. She photographed everything, asked questions about the schedule charts on the wall, examined the weight tracking log. The documentation painted a picture of comprehensive control that went far beyond normal parental oversight. Jeffrey explained the safety plan requirements. Russell must have no unsupervised contact with me until the investigation concluded, which meant Mom would need to be present whenever Russell was home. All physical discipline must cease immediately, with violations resulting in my immediate removal from the home. I'd have weekly check-ins with Amanda to assess ongoing safety. They'd be conducting interviews with my teachers, reviewing medical records for any past injuries, and gathering information to determine if the abuse warranted criminal charges. Russell's mask slipped during this explanation, irritation flashing across his face before the concerned parent expression returned. He agreed to the safety plan requirements with thinly veiled resentment, and I could see him calculating how to navigate these restrictions while maintaining control. The next 2 weeks were tense and strange. Russell complied with the letter of the safety plan, but found ways around the spirit of it. He couldn't physically grab me anymore, so he'd stand very close when delivering lectures, invading my personal space in ways that felt threatening. He couldn't enforce his correction exercises, so he'd assign additional academic work as consequences, piling on homework until I was staying up past midnight completing assignments he'd created specifically to punish me. He couldn't prevent me from leaving my room, but he'd create social consequences through Mom, who'd express disappointment or concern about my behavior in ways that felt like emotional manipulation. The control had shifted from physical to psychological, and while there were no new bruises, the atmosphere felt suffocating and hostile. School became my refuge. Ms. Blakely checked in with me daily, monitoring my emotional state and documenting any concerning changes. She'd connected me with the school psychologist, Dr. Victor Ashton, who specialized in trauma and abuse recovery and had 26 years of experience in adolescent psychology. Dr. Ashton helped me understand that what I'd experienced met clinical definitions of abuse, that Russell's methods weren't strict parenting but systematic control designed to break down my autonomy and make me completely dependent on his approval. He explained learned helplessness, the concept that prolonged abuse conditions victims to stop seeking escape because they've internalized that resistance is pointless. He helped me recognize that my lack of friendships wasn't natural social evolution, but deliberate isolation that made me dependent solely on Russell and Mom for all human connection. The therapy sessions were painful because they required acknowledging that my home life was fundamentally dysfunctional rather than just strict. Amanda Whitfield conducted her weekly check-ins, asking about Russell's compliance with the safety plan and whether I felt the situation was improving. I'd report the technical compliance, but also the subtle intimidation, and she'd document everything while looking increasingly concerned. She said the investigation was expanding because interviews with my teachers had revealed concerning patterns. Multiple teachers had noticed my social isolation, my anxiety about phone usage, my reluctance to participate in group projects or after-school activities. My physics teacher, Mr. Leonard Cho, who'd taught for 15 years, had documented instances where I'd visibly flinched at loud noises or sudden movements, trauma responses he'd seen in students from abusive homes. My English teacher, Miss Rebecca Frost, had kept essays I'd written that referenced strict household rules and fear of disappointing parental expectations, material that read differently now in context of the abuse investigation. The medical record review revealed additional evidence. I'd had 3 emergency room visits over the past 4 years for injuries Russell had explained as accidents: a sprained wrist from falling during exercise, bruised ribs from tripping on stairs, and a minor concussion from hitting my head on a cabinet door. The ER doctors had noted in their records that the injury explanations seemed inconsistent with the physical evidence, but without other red flags, they'd accepted Russell's accounts and treated the injuries. Now, with pattern recognition, those incidents looked like abuse I'd been coached to misrepresent. Amanda said this historical evidence strengthened the case significantly, suggesting long-term abuse rather than isolated incidents. The Cornell early decision application deadline was November 3rd, and Russell had been anxiously monitoring my progress on finalizing the submission. But under the CPS safety plan restrictions, he couldn't supervise my work directly anymore, which meant he couldn't control the application content. I'd been meeting with Ms. Blakely to actually work on my personal essay, writing my authentic voice rather than Russell's corporate language. The essay I produced was raw and honest, discussing the loss of my father, the struggle to find identity under strict oversight, the gradual realization that achievement motivated by fear wasn't genuine success. It was nothing like the essay Russell had written for me, and it reflected who I actually was rather than who Russell wanted admissions committees to see. Ms. Blakely said it was powerful and real, the kind of essay that revealed character rather than performing it. I submitted the Cornell application on November 1st, with my authentic essay, my genuine activity list, and Ms. Blakely's recommendation letter that apparently discussed my resilience and growth rather than just academic achievement. Russell asked the next day if I'd submitted, and I said yes. He asked if I'd used the essay he'd written, and I said I'd revised it significantly with Ms. Blakely's help. His jaw tightened, but he couldn't challenge this directly without violating the safety plan restrictions. Mom asked to see the final essay, and I said it was already submitted, so there was no point reviewing it now. The small act of defiance felt enormous, reclaiming control over something Russell had monopolized. 3 weeks after the initial CPS report, Amanda called to say the investigation had found credible evidence of physical and emotional abuse, and they were recommending criminal charges. The prosecutor's office would review the case and determine what charges to file. Additionally, CPS was requiring Russell to move out of the house temporarily while they assessed whether Mom could provide adequate protection as a custodial parent or whether alternative placement would be necessary. Russell would have supervised visitation rights only, with all contact monitored by a neutral third party. The requirements were presented as non-negotiable. Russell could leave voluntarily and comply with the safety plan, or I'd be removed to foster care immediately. The choice was framed to pressure compliance, and Russell agreed to move out rather than face the embarrassment of me being in state custody. Russell packed and left on a Friday evening, moving to an extended stay hotel near his office. Mom cried throughout the packing process, treating his departure like I'd driven him out rather than understanding his abuse had created this consequence. After he left, the house felt different, the air less heavy, though Mom's resentment filled some of that space. She blamed me constantly, saying I'd destroyed our family, that I'd ruined Russell's reputation and career, that I'd been ungrateful for everything he'd provided. She couldn't see past her attachment to Russell to recognize that his methods had harmed me, that her failure to protect me had enabled years of abuse. Dr. Ashton helped me understand that Mom's response was her own trauma and denial, that I wasn't responsible for her inability to prioritize my safety over her relationship. The criminal investigation moved forward with Detective Irving Kosinski, who'd worked in domestic violence and child abuse cases for 21 years. He interviewed me extensively, documenting the abuse history, the specific incidents of physical discipline, the control systems Russell had established. He reviewed the photographs of my bruising, the medical records of past injuries, the documentation from teachers and counselors. He interviewed Russell, who maintained that his discipline methods were appropriate parenting that had been mischaracterized as abuse by an ungrateful teenager and overzealous school officials. Russell's performance was polished and convincing, the concerned stepfather who'd tried his best and was being punished for caring too much. But the physical evidence contradicted his narrative, and Detective Kosinski had seen enough abuse cases to recognize the patterns. The prosecutor, Helen Mercer, who'd specialized in family violence cases for 17 years, filed charges of child abuse and assault in mid-December. The charges were based on the documented bruising, the medical history of suspicious injuries, and testimony from me and multiple school officials about Russell's systematic control and physical discipline. Russell was arrested at his office, which he'd apparently found humiliating based on Mom's angry phone calls blaming me for the public spectacle. His employer placed him on administrative leave pending the outcome of the case, exactly the career consequence Mom had predicted. She acted like I'd caused this through malicious reporting rather than Russell causing it through abusive behavior, and our relationship deteriorated to hostile silence with her speaking to me only when necessary. Living alone with Mom was lonely and tense, but it was better than living under Russell's constant surveillance and control. I started eating foods I'd been denied for years, discovering I actually liked them when they weren't framed as forbidden inflammatory substances. I stayed up reading past Russell's enforced bedtime because I enjoyed having autonomy over my own sleep schedule. I made tentative attempts to reconnect with former friends, explaining that my family situation had been complicated, but was changing, asking if they wanted to hang out. Some responded warmly, others had moved on, but I started rebuilding a social life that felt like mine, rather than something I'd been permitted. Dr. Ashton said these were important steps in reclaiming autonomy and identity, separate from Russell's definitions. The Cornell early decision results came out in mid-December, and I opened the email alone in my room, rather than with Russell monitoring my reaction. Accepted. I'd gotten into Cornell on my authentic application, with my honest essay, representing who I actually was, rather than Russell's construction. The achievement felt different than I'd expected, bittersweet rather than triumphant. I'd accomplished what Russell had demanded, but I'd done it my way after escaping his control. I called Ms. Blakely to share the news, and she said she was proud of me, that the acceptance validated that I was capable and strong independent of Russell's forced systems. I didn't tell Mom or Russell immediately, savoring having this piece of good news be mine alone before it became ammunition in family dynamics. The legal process continued through winter and spring. Russell's attorney negotiated a plea agreement. He'd plead guilty to reduce charges of reckless endangerment rather than go to trial on the more serious abuse and assault charges. The agreement included 1 year in jail with credit for time served, 3 years of probation, mandatory completion of parenting classes and anger management, and a permanent restraining order preventing contact with me. The prosecutor explained this was a reasonable outcome that avoided trial trauma while ensuring accountability and protection. I agreed to the plea because I didn't want to testify in open court about the years of abuse, and the outcome provided some justice even if it felt insufficient for 6 years of systematic harm. Mom divorced Russell during his jail sentence, finally recognizing that staying married to a convicted abuser was untenable even for her, but she never apologized to me, never acknowledged that she'd failed to protect me, never took responsibility for enabling Russell's control. She moved through the divorce and its aftermath treating herself as Russell's victim, rather than recognizing she'd been complicit in my abuse. Our relationship remained strained and distant, functional but not close. I made plans to leave for Cornell in August, counting down to when I'd have physical distance from her and the house that held so many bad memories. Graduation in June felt significant, marking the end of surviving high school under Russell's control and the beginning of independence. Ms. Blakely attended the ceremony, sitting with Dr. Ashton and Amanda Whitfield, a small contingent of people who'd actually protected me when my own parents failed. They'd coordinated their investigation and intervention in ways that had saved me from years more abuse, and I was grateful even though the process had been painful and complicated. I gave Ms. Blakely a card thanking her for noticing what others had ignored, for taking action despite resistance from my parents, for believing that the bruising mattered even when I'd been trained to minimize it. I'm 19 now, finishing my freshman year at Cornell, and I'm still processing the 6 years I spent under Russell's control. Therapy continues with a trauma specialist on campus who helps me work through the complicated aftermath of abuse. I struggle with perfectionism and anxiety about performance, residual effects of Russell's constant monitoring and impossible standards. I'm learning to set boundaries, to recognize when people are trying to control me, to trust my own judgment about what's healthy versus harmful. I'm building friendships based on authentic connection rather than utility, dating someone who respects my autonomy, and discovering who I am separate from Russell's definitions and demands. Mom and I talk occasionally, surface-level conversations about school and logistics, but we haven't addressed the fundamental betrayal of her choosing Russell over my safety. Maybe we'll have that conversation eventually, or maybe the relationship will remain permanently damaged by her failure to protect me. I've made peace with either outcome because my healing doesn't depend on her acknowledgement or apology. Russell is out of jail now, living somewhere across the country per the restraining order requirements, and I don't think about him much anymore. He was a chapter of my life that ended, and I'm writing new chapters that belong entirely to me. People sometimes ask why the school counselor locked her office door during our routine check-in. The answer is that Miss Kendra Blakely saw bruising on my arms that indicated physical abuse, and she needed to document evidence and file a mandatory report before my stepfather could discover the intervention and potentially destroy evidence or retaliate. She locked the door to ensure privacy and safety while confronting me with a truth I'd been systematically conditioned to deny, that Russell's discipline wasn't helping me succeed, but was systematically harming me under the guise of accountability. One counselor with 19 years of experience recognized abuse patterns I'd normalized through years of manipulation, took photos that became evidence, and filed the report that started an investigation that ended 6 years of control. She did what my mother should have done, what other adults in my life had suspected but never acted on, and she likely saved me from years more abuse that would have continued if I'd gone to college still believing Russell's methods were love rather than violence dressed up as structure. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.